Last speaker this morning is Professor Jason Carroll. We like to mention first that he is a fellow of the Wheatley Institution, and as such, he's the energy and the creativity behind a good deal of what we do in our family initiative. He's also Professor of Marriage and Family Studies in the School of Family Life here at Brigham Young University. He currently serves as the Associate Director in the School of Family Life. He received his PhD in Family and Social Science from the University of Minnesota. He's internationally recognized researcher and educator in areas of marital intimacy, marriage readiness among young adults, the effectiveness of marriage education, and modern threats to marriage, such as pornography, delayed age of marriage, materialism, premarital sexuality, and non-marital childbirth, things like that. We are very blessed to be able to have him as part of our initiative, and we'll now hear from Professor Jason Carroll.
Well, just quickly, as representing Wheatley, we've been so pleased with the round table yesterday and today, and we thank our speakers and for the efforts they've made to be with us and to share insights and views. Hopefully you've seen and caught the notion that this is the beginning of something for us in Wheatley, in a spring family roundtable, and various ways that we'd like to grow that and expand that. But we've been very pleased with this first coming together in this first event. So, well, unlike some of our other speakers, I have the opportunity to have some current and former students in the audience and a few familiar faces. They're all trying to figure out a few things right now to see if it's really going to work. First off, they're trying to figure out, is it really going to be possible for Dr. Carroll to stand at that podium for his talk? Or will the kinetic energy just build to a point that he will finally explode? My classes know that I'm a pretty infamous walker and pacer, and I was just telling Troy as we were setting up that the lapel mic is right here. I could unwrap it, and he reminds me of what a problem I cause for him at all of our conferences when I start to wander the stage, and it doesn't work too well for filming. The other thing that a few of my students and others are trying to figure out is, does he really own a suit jacket? I didn't know if he really owned a suit jacket, and there he is with one. So I'm not sure if he borrowed it or not for the morning, but he does have one. So, well, to get us started, I will get us back on schedule, so we'll be mindful of our time here and for the commitments that you've made with the symposium today. So I'll hit with the most important things first, and the most important thing is the joke that we need to get started with. A few of you have heard it. It does have relevance to the talk or to the presentation. I've always used this one at times because it ties back into my profession. While I am a marriage researcher in my current life, I have some marriage therapy and counseling background, and there's some good jokes back in that direction. So a couple goes in to see a marriage therapist. He invites them in, and they sit down, asks them the common question, why is it you've come to my clinic today? And as often the case, the wife speaks up first and starts to list a few of the things that aren't going too well in the relationship. And then, as also sometimes the case, she gets on a little bit of a roll and starts to list these things. So the husband kind of settles back, and the counselor settles back, and they listen to this for a few minutes. And without saying anything, the counselor stands up, walks around the desk, pulls the wife from her chair, gives her a passionate kiss, and then sits her back down. Turns to the husband and says, "That is what your wife needs at least 3 times a week. Do you think you can handle that?" And the husband thinks for a minute and says, "Well, I can bring her in on Mondays and Wednesdays, but I golf on Fridays." Now, what does that have to do with the presentation today? Not much, just that we're kind of been going at it for a while, and it's always good to spend a little bit of time not just stretching our legs, but stretching our minds a little bit. But in some ways, it does have a lot to do with what I'd like to talk about today. We live in a culture, as we were just saying in the last question and answer session, where we receive a lot of scripts, a lot of ideas, a lot of advice about relationships, and ultimately about marriage. A lot of how-tos for this to occur. And, as our speakers have pointed out the last 2 days, many of the scripts of today are best seen in the lens of a myth, in inadequate, insufficient, and in some cases just downright incongruent and inharmonious with the true nature of things, both of individuals but also of relationships as well. So as we've heard us talk through the roundtable, we've been talking about the rapidly changing views of marriage and family and the patterns around that in our culture. If you've paid close attention to the speakers the last 2 days, and if you haven't had a chance to be in all the sessions, I really encourage you as we post those up on the Wheatley website and have a chance as we make the efforts to record these so that they can be seen by a broader audience and by those that we'd like to have see that. You'll see that all of our speakers and all of the scholars that have been with us have emphasized key fragmentations that are occurring in our cultural understandings of marriage. Fragmentations that are changing how we view, and as I would like to focus on today, have changing how we prepare for and believe that we should make ready for a successful, loving, lasting marriage relationship. And in ways that we are setting ourselves up for the very things that we're trying to avoid, rather than ultimately in a true process of preparation and a true process of readiness. 3 key fragmentations I'd like to emphasize, although they're not comprehensive. There's others we could address. But we clearly see in the marriage context, in the rising culture, a fragmentation of marriage from the sacred. We see this in the increasing trends and patterns of secularism in the culture, the increasing number of couples today that approach marriage relationships with no connection of meaning of sacred, no connection to a religious community or affiliation, in ways where it is simply a relationship that is of the couple and by the couple and for the couple in its conceptions. So the notion of sacred and the notion, as we've had some mention already today, of covenant, a notion of something more transcendent, of deeper meaning, is lost for so many couples. As we've seen in just our last presentation so well, marriage being separated from sex and sexuality, no longer connected to the ways that we express sexuality in our broader culture, and we see this fragmentation, and ultimately a separation from children, and the meaning of it as a child-centered part of our culture and an institution. These are rapid changes, dramatic changes. As the students in my marriage preparation class hear on a regular basis, you live in a weird time. A time that often, if it's the only part of the stream that you've known, it's easy to believe that this is just the way it is or the way it's been understood, when fundamentally things are changing rapidly to a way that even a generation or two ago would see this as very different notions or different ideas. From this fragmentation, and I believe one of the greatest evidences of and creators of in this reciprocal approach to this marriage fragmentation is the growing patterns of what I'd call marriage preparation paradoxes. Behaviors that young people are engaging in, and let's be clear, often at the encouragement and insistence of the parents and those that are trying to help and guide them and make them ready for those later stages of life and marriage and family life. We see a culture growing where we are getting a so-called conventional wisdom of how to be prepared and how to be ready and how to assure a relationship and a marriage of success in ways that are fundamentally, at their core, paradoxical. Now, let's make sure we're all kind of using the terminology the same way, thinking of this, since this will be a key part of what I'd like to emphasize. A paradox, we'll use this definition, a proposition that despite apparently sound reasoning leads to a conclusion that is senseless, logically unacceptable, and self-contradictory. Right? So despite this apparent sound reasoning, which largely comes from buying into a script, you come to consequences that are the opposite of what you intend. A very, very simple, everyday way to think about a paradox is a bit like turning the jar lid the wrong direction. And while we intensify our efforts and are convinced that we are going to loosen that jar lid, we may be in fact actually tightening it and going in the complete opposite direction of what we intend or what we're trying to do. My primary message for you today is that our culture is becoming saturated in marriage preparation paradoxes, behaviors that are believed to increase one's chances of marital success, which actually on average diminish the chances of having a loving and lasting marriage. Now, one of the things we've done is we've designed the roundtable this year, and as I would encourage you, not just today, but as you think about this, we had some great questions about messaging and how do we talk to others and how do I share with others. I hope you've caught and thought a little bit about the layers or levels, if you will, that I believe are needed to have strong and convincing discussions and conversations, while they may be in the more private or intimate dialogues or more in the public square around these types of issues. We saw yesterday, for example, what I would see as level one, some examples of some level one arguments that are critical here. This is looking at the facts. This is looking at the trends, looking at the direction that we see things headed. And as we see some of those demographic patterns of family decline, they are important pieces for us to be able to share and to understand what's happening in our culture. And in particular, when those trends get tied to diminished well-being and to outcomes that are problematic for children and for adults, that type of evidence conversation becomes critical, becomes important. But I would help us appreciate that if that's as far as we can go, we're describing much of the difficulties, but my experience is many people set that aside quite easily because, as we all know, many of us hear any statistic and say, well, there's exceptions. And I think the rising generation in particular, I think millennials are quite gifted, and some of you know who you are, at saying to yourselves, well, I must be the exception, right? So it's easy for people to do that or to just see that description or that pattern. So I think together with those layers of that descriptive element, below that is the next layer that I would say we need to understand the logic of the behavior or the pattern or the choice. And I'm not talking about your logic, I'm talking about the logic of those that engage in the paradoxes. They don't engage in paradoxes because they say, wow, this isn't going to work. I think I'll try this, right? Look at our definition, despite apparently sound reasoning. There's often a belief that there's very sound reasons to do what they are doing. If you don't understand that logic, if you don't know the reasons that are being given, it's very hard to then have the deeper, fuller conversation that gets at the root of why that isn't leading to the consequences that they may have. So this is this is getting a bit more into their explanations and patterns. But as I hope you've witnessed today, and I've been so appreciative to our speakers that have been with us this morning, and to Jay and Melissa's comments that have been so perfect about what I would see as a layer that is even getting beneath that. That fundamentally we need to step back and recognize where so much of what is happening in our culture and in our society that lead to these behaviors start at beginning starting points that are fundamentally not headed in the right direction. When we don't recognize the fundamental design of what it means to be human. What is the potential and possibility for meaning that we have? Jay will chuckle because I quoted the one. My other favorite quote was, "We're not guppies," right? But we often approach many of these issues as if, I don't know, I think we'd even be insulting the guppies if we'd say sometimes what we pick up and our patterns are that way. Getting back to those core understandings become a critical part. So let me share. That's the key message that I wanted to highlight for you, was to pay attention to these paradoxes, to think about the different levels and ways that you can engage in that dialogue with the evidentiary patterns, but also getting to understanding the reasons and explanations, the logic behind the paradoxes, but then also getting to pointing out and helping others see. This gets beyond a description. This ultimately gets to an explanation. If we can help explain these paradoxes, there is far more power, both in our own hearts and in the hearts of others, for them to recognize that they are indeed paradoxes and to see the truth of this. So, what I've put together for us now is fundamentally some illustrations, some examples. So there's not an effort here to be comprehensive, and I will focus more on marriage preparation, thinking of the audience and group that we might have. We'll focus on the young adult culture, the relationship formation culture that we have. I think this could be expanded and looked at in broader parts of stages of life and in the marital context. But let's use this as the key example. We had Scott Stanley with us yesterday, a leading scholar in the world on cohabitation patterns and of this. But we've seen for a very long time, right, this becomes in some ways the quintessential paradox that we have in our culture today around marriage preparation. We've moved in very quick form from a culture that has moved cohabitation from the fringe, right? Something that is ultimately living in sin, shacking up, something that's been among us, but something that wasn't accepted, and it definitely wasn't deemed as something that was needed. And we've moved through that transgression, from that transgression mindset, we've moved to a notion too around, well, this being permissible, it's okay, to now it is the young person who is choosing not to cohabit who has to defend themselves. What? You would marry somebody without living together? Is that wise? Is that smart? You start to see the logic that's in that, right? We've seen for a very long time one of the driving logics behind cohabitation is the notion that cohabitation acts like a test drive. You wouldn't buy a car without test driving it, would it? So why wouldn't you do that with a relationship? Which is striking, because look at what this logic reveals. It reveals a pro-marriage orientation in some way. I want my marriage to work. I want my marriage to last. I'm doing this in a way that I believe will ultimately help me, right? But as we've seen and we've known for some time, right, the association of cohabitation with later marital success for a generation now has proven to be, at its core, a paradox. Those who test drive the relationship don't see better marital results, they see worse. And despite all of the statistical gymnastics that social science scholars are doing now, at best, we see articles now coming out trying to help us see that cohabitation won't harm you. 25, 30 years ago, some of our best and brightest minds in the social sciences said we're going to see a huge reduction in divorce because we have such a surge in cohabitation. It will act as a Darwinian survival of the fittest mechanism that'll weed out the weak relationships from the herd, and the strong ones will survive, and our marriages will be better, and our divorce rate will go down. We didn't see that occur. So we started exploring this and have seen this cohabitation effect. Ultimately, we see this paradox emerge and the logic that is within it. How do we counter this? How do you point this out? The key false idea here is that cohabitation even remotely test drives marriage. As Professor Stanley showed us yesterday, commitment changes the process and the way we live. And you know what's funny? This is academics fooling themselves when we even make these claims. Who knows better than anybody that cohabitation is not the same as marriage? Joe and Jane cohabiter. Go tell Joe, hey Joe, I understand cohabitation is just the same as marriage, so why don't you marry Jane? What? Okay, now who did she tell you to talk to me? Did her mom talk to you? Joe knows full well that marriage is going to involve something very different than cohabitation. That's the reason why he's willing to cohabit but not to marry. So at its basic core, the idea that we are test driving a marital relationship is a false premise from its core. And this is why a variety of studies and things that we've looked at have never shown cohabitation able to replicate and produce the benefits, lifestyle patterns, well-being for children that we see in marriage. Because couples are not just couples. And the commitment and that long-term view that Professor Stanley talked about with cohabitation changes the very way that couples live. So at its core, we can start to see that come apart, and we see that be something underneath. So we understand the patterns. Important to know that evidentiary pattern that cohabitation doesn't lead to lower divorce. But go past the description. Make sure you can get to the explanation. Find those comparisons that people can resonate with. Comparing cohabitors to married couples is a bit like comparing renters to homeowners. I ask my students this all the time. How many of you rent? Most of the hands in the room go up. How many of you would like new carpet in your apartment? Now they hold up two hands in desperation of, yes, I would love new carpet. How many of you are willing to pay for some new carpet in your apartment? All the hands go down. Why do they go down? Because they don't have a long-term view with that apartment, do they? They're not even sure if it's going to be 2 weeks. And when we get close to semester change, wow, everything's up for grabs. I can't even tell you where I'll be in 4 days. If that's how far your commitment view is, you act and behave differently. Homeowners are different. They have a different lens. They have a different view. It causes them to live and act differently. If you want to test this, you can head down to any of the home improvement stores that are around us. Just do a little survey. Tomorrow's a Saturday. It'll be busy. Weather's getting warm. Just ask people as they come out, are you a homeowner or a renter? And what will you find? Except for the one person with like one pack of light bulbs, you're going to find people coming out of there that are homeowners. Homeowners make investments in that. They act differently. They plant trees. They do put in carpet. They do those things that have the long-term payoff. The process is different, right? So this is a great example for us to think about the type of paradoxical thinking. Another key one we have now that ties into a lot of the behavior patterns and trends we've gotten into during the discussions of the round table is what I would call the sexual chemistry paradox. The conventional wisdom, and it's reached that point in our society today, is that two people should test their sexual compatibility before they commit to each other. So for many, this is something you must test before you become exclusive. For others, you definitely need to test it before you become engaged. And now the vast majority of our culture would endorse this is something you need to test before you get married. And again, those who follow the purity pattern that Jay mentioned for us are now the ones on the defensive saying, really, you would do that? Don't you want to have a good intimate relationship in marriage? Well, then shouldn't you test it? Shouldn't you make sure you're compatible? Shouldn't you make sure you have that chemistry? And the flip side of that, as I see on our culture and on our campus, as we talk about in marriage prep and in other places, many of those committed because of faith reasoning or other experiences to a purity ethic now start to question if they're actually really ready for that part of marriage. There's great concern. Well, I'm actually quite nervous about that. Why? Because I'm not experienced. Oh, so you're kind of living it, but you don't really buy it, do you? Because now you're still buying into the cultural idea that somehow you're lacking a needed form of preparation because you haven't tested the physical sexual relationship in the ways that culture is holding up as a needed element of this. So we see this as a pattern that particularly any relationship that could lead to marriage does this. So the central hypothesis here is that you need to test this sexual chemistry, and it has given rise to a couple of our most problematic marriage preparation paradoxes in our culture today. Again, we see the test drive hypothesis emerge. You need to test this. So in a particular relationship, you ought to test that sexual chemistry compatibility. Interesting how much we talk about this, and even in our media. You can think about this in TV shows and movies or other things you've seen, where the idea is I'm getting along with someone very, very well. Communication, emotional intimacy, sharing time together, the interactions of that. But I still don't know if we have sexual chemistry, because it's something completely unique and distinct. That's why we use a term like chemistry, right? Now, I've actually had a few students, as we've kind of taken this on in marriage prep, say, well, you're taking all the mystery out of it. I says, well, if you like that kind of mystery, right? If you're trying to, want this part of your life to be, I'm going to turn to the next page and find out what happens. I would prefer to have an understanding of that design and how we're designed and how does that happen. But it's seen as something separate and distinct, something that you could never test in conversation or relation. Ultimately, it has to come down to simply physically testing that chemistry that you won't know unless that happens or that occurs. Another variation of this is a pattern that we see that I'd call the sow your wild oats hypothesis. Pay attention to how much you hear language about people saying how much people need to get this out of their system before they're ready to settle down. We use the term settle down all the time when it comes to marriage preparation and readiness. Part of this with sexual chemistry testing is the idea you not only need to test it within your specific relationship, you need to test it in a variety of relationships. How do you know what you'll prefer? How do you know what you'll choose? How do you know what really is good sexual chemistry unless you've tested it, right? The basic idea, you need to go to 5 stores in the mall before you pick an outfit. You can't just go to one. You're much more likely to be happier with your outfit choice if you've gone to multiple stores and seen what's out there. Somehow we never stop to think for a minute that people are not clothing, and we don't just put these inanimate objects back on the rack, but we kind of do that with our relationship testing. So what do we see from this? And I'll move through this fairly quickly. We see patterns of very early sexual timing occurring in young adult relationships today in the United States. The data coming out of the Ad Health data set, our large 90,000 sample study that has followed young people from the time they're 13 now into their mid-30s, has identified that in the young adult years, this comes from Sharon Sassler's work at Cornell, about 50% of couples now report becoming sexually active within the first few weeks of starting to have some sort of a relationship with each other. Early sex relationships are becoming very, very common. We talk about a hookup phenomenon, but many couples now are finding their origins in hookups. It is the hookup that lingers. It is the hookup that keeps going. Now, the question is, in this idea of sexual chemistry testing, right, would be, well, that's a pretty smart thing to do. And if you don't start early, at least have a little bit of a later pattern. Maybe you're going to wait until you're exclusive. Maybe you're going to have a bit of a later pattern, but once you're exclusive with each other, once you're boyfriend or girlfriend, clearly once you're fiancés, this needs to occur or this needs to happen. It's only smart. It's the test drive that needs to occur. Married sex couples, those who reserve this purity ethic that Jay was talking about to us, they're the ones clearly at risk because they're going to have some buyer's remorse because they didn't test this part of the relationship, right? What I'm showing you in the slide that I put up is a study that my colleagues Dean Busby and Brian Willoughby and I published in the Journal of Family Psychology a few years back, where we took a national sample of married couples and we evaluated their sexual histories and the patterns they had moving towards their marriage. And we find these 3 groups emerge quite readily and quite easily. And we evaluate their current marriage relationships and control for a wide variety of factors and try to isolate the sexual timing influence in their relationship. As you'll see here from this slide, looking at their satisfaction, looking at their stability, meaning how much they're talking about or thinking about divorce. So a stable relationship is one where they're not talking about or thinking about divorce. Their level of sexual quality, measured in this study by the reported frequency of sexual intimacy, their satisfaction with that intimacy, and a reverse-coded pattern of how many problems they have in this aspect of life. Together with the quality of their communication, we see a striking, statistically significant pattern emerge. Rather than this idea that couples who abstain are harmed by this, we actually see them better off on all accounts, including the sexual quality reported in the relationship. Maybe they were preparing after all. Maybe the types of preparation we're saying are needed aren't really the types of preparation that are needed. Maybe if our hearts and our bodies are meant to work together, the preparation of the heart is far more critical to the quality of the relationship, even the sexual union, than simply the body itself. This pretended fragmentation that we've talked about, that the culture tries to tell us can or occur. We see this happening in areas around the patterns of pornography in our culture as well. Perhaps nothing is a greater indicator of sexual fragmentation and pulling sexuality from relationships, let alone from marriage. In another study that our team did, and I'll move through this and send you the references, much of the concern, and we hear people talk about, and I know on this campus there's quite a bit of talk about the notion about, well, the problem with pornography is that it can become an addiction. And when there's an addiction pattern, that's what ruins marriages, right? Now, we can talk at another time about the reality and prevalence of addiction, and I think it can occur, and it can be a problem. But I think there's a much bigger issue here than the addiction issue of pornography, which will always be a much smaller group, than for us to look at the socialization and understanding pattern of pornography that is there regardless of whether or not a compulsion or addiction type pattern emerges to this. And at its core, I want you to pay attention to something we've been highlighting, which is the fundamental gender gap we see in use and participation with pornography. If there is one conclusive finding of the early pornography research to date, and make no mistake, it is early. There's still not large funding and large, well-done research out there. But if you look at the series of studies that have been done, the most overwhelming conclusive finding is there is a massive gender gap. And so we have a pattern here. When you think about this as a coupling researcher, as a marriage researcher, and you look at it in that context, it gives us something that also exposes this paradox connected to sexual chemistry testing. So as you look at this simple young adult sample that we've had, you look at the regular pattern. So as I've highlighted in the boxes there, look at the differences between the young adult men and young adult women in the frequency of use. You see a gap if you look at just do you use or not, but you really see the gap emerge when we start to pay attention to that pattern in frequency of use. Now, if you start to look at this at couples, and in our data sets we have the ability to look at dating couples, cohabiting couples, married couples, notice in these frequency patterns too, we're seeing oftentimes 4, 5, 6, as much as 8 times as much frequent use among men as we see among women. We see a coupling issue here then. What does this mean to that fundamental meaning and symbolism of the relationship? How does it tie to that sense of exclusivity, that sense of monogamy that was talked about? Not just the monogamy of the body, but the monogamy of the mind, the monogamy of the eyes in this context. Is that simply challenged and in that type of pattern? One last slide. This one is striking that even as we get into relationships, another place we see the gap is in what is known and what is really understood. This slide shows you the reports of husbands of what is their actual use of pornography levels. And then what you see with the tan lines are the wife's perceptions of that use. What we see is only about half of marriages are situations where the wife is reporting the same level that the husband is reporting. There tends to be a large gap. And in many cases, as much as 30 to 40% of relationships that is more use than he's aware of. And if you notice the main gap on the bar graphs, it's a sizable portion of married women reporting that he doesn't use it all when he actually does. Now again, think about the logic that is here and the logic we hear about pornography, right? The most common word we hear with pornography in our culture today is, it's harmless. It's harmless. What's the big deal? It's part of the reason why we struggle in the academy to even get serious, well-done research because, well, why would we put serious money in testing or looking at or examining something so harmless? Now, the sexual ethics within pornography, the way they influence the conceptions of that and the view of that, or of deep exploration, and even at its basic prevalence patterns, we see this as something that goes in quite a different direction. And, as we should not be surprised, we are seeing growing trends and patterns of couples reporting levels of conflict in their relationships related to this. Somehow this harmless preparation, this part of young adulthood, this part of sexual chemistry testing, this wonderful form of sexual education that we've created, the paradox starts to emerge in relationships as we see the conflict and it not fitting with the harmony and the pattern of those things. So ultimately then, what is it that we have to be able to articulate? All of the data trends move in this direction. The evidentiary level shows this. But what we're missing is much of the explanation beneath the description. And this is that fundamental understanding that sex is never just sex. And very much so, if you cannot test drive a relationship prior to marriage, you cannot test drive sexual chemistry, or whatever term we want to give it. Commitment and the level of commitment and the investment and the lens influences the very experience itself. The meaning, the symbolism, the entire experience. So any type of sexual experience that comes prior to commitment is at its very nature different than an experience that comes after and within the commitment. Nothing is being tested. In fact, if anything, we are creating some of our greatest problems and some of our greatest struggles, as the data shows that the early sexual timing couples have risk factors for later marital success. Our other study that I didn't include a slide on, and others are finding this too, people transitioning to marriage with multiple sexual partners are at increased risk for divorce probability in these types of patterns. So we ultimately need to help realize that there's key reasons why this is happening and why this is occurring, okay? The key here is that it may be that it's disrupting intentional partner selection. When couples move quickly into the physical intimacy of the relationship, Scott Stanley joked with us yesterday as he sprayed his oxytocin spray, and we talked about brain responses, right, that are a part of romantic and physical attraction. And I hope you'll always recognize and realize that's what they are. They're brain responses. The brain by itself originates nothing. The interpretation and meaning making always has to be there first for the brain to respond and to trigger. So while we might see it in part of the process, we be careful to stay away from labeling it as the origin or the creator or the driver of what is happening or is occurring. But as we have that intensity of excitement and we label it in these terms and in these ways, we see a real loss in the possibility for intentional partner selection. To truly choose a partner. It's what was talked about yesterday as premature entanglement, talked about as an inertia theory. As those in the room who would understand and recognize the language of a religious leader like Elder Holland, it's what he would fundamentally call a pattern of counterfeit intimacy. We start to believe a relationship is stronger than it actually is because of those powerful physiological rewards that we may experience. They cause us to minimize and overlook social, emotional, spiritual incompatibilities that may lie in the relationship. So in many ways, we set ourselves up for that poor partner selection. And we lose the ability to deeply endow a relationship with deep meaning and symbolism, we lose that fundamental essence of what sexuality is to be in that human context. And at best, we share sex like a guppy, not with the deep ability of meaning and transcendent experience that we have as humans. This is why these paradoxes emerge. This is why they fundamentally are problematic. Let me move us forward here. I'll just highlight a couple of the other areas I'd point out. And the paradoxes are the same, and so we won't climb through the evidence and the data with things. Another key one that we see is a pattern that the older is better paradox. We have a generation that has largely heard and understood that teenage marriages have higher risks and don't do as well. Evidence continues to show that. But we've assumed because that's the case that older is always better, that every added year will give you the same amount of benefit and return, when the evidence has showed us quite the contrary. And the evidence is now pointing in the directions of a curvilinear pattern, particularly when we look at full marital quality. So we are on the beginnings of a conversation of not just talking about the risks of early marriage in the teenage years, but also the increasingly identified risks of later marriage, which at their core are more demographically relevant for us to pay attention to, because the diminishing part of our population are the ones marrying in the teens, while we are quickly approaching a pattern where over 50% of the population will be marrying over the age of 30. So those risks may be the ones that are fundamentally much more at their core. Again, underneath the evidentiary view here is the explanation of why have we bought into the idea that chronological or biological development is the same as maturational development. At its core, we've lost that ability to recognize that it is those things that we embrace, those ideas that we give ourselves over to, that fundamentally define maturity and readiness and preparation. Not just simply the ticking by of another year or hitting some sort of arbitrary, biologically defined notion of age will make someone more prepared or more ready. So there's much more we could talk about there, or we could highlight and get to that point. We see this happening also with the impacts of marriage in the 20-something years, the fundamental idea that this is something that is a transition of loss. The dominant language in our culture today for people, particularly in their earlies and mid-20s, is that marriage will be a transition of loss in their lives. What I mean by that is the dialogue is what we give up, what we'll have to stop doing, what won't be able to be accomplished. So in many ways, that is the dominant idea here, and that is causing us to reframe the 20s and the third decade of life in a very different way of what it's intended for, what its purposes are, that'll really make us prepared. One of the key mantras of this is that the 20s is the time to find yourself, right? Go in the corner and find yourself. And when you have found yourself, you'll then be ready for, right, this relational marriage, family reality that awaits you. If we go back to the human design and who we are, we indeed find ourselves in those relational bonds, starting with the spiritual bonds and then extending those to the familial. We indeed find ourselves when we lose ourselves. And as we strive to simply find ourselves, that is quite often when we are ultimately lost, because we've turned away from the true nature of who we are and at its core. And whether that be expressed in the language of the New Testament and the fundamental teachings of Christ, whether that be talked about in attachment research, and that those attachment needs are real and profound and ultimately are denied, and we cannot give them to ourselves. This idea of a gift that we ultimately must give to each other is critical because it's true to our nature and who we are. So at its core, this would be my central thought and idea, that this is the task before us. And as some of our questioners have said through the days, at times it feels a bit daunting. At times it feels a bit overwhelming. But I think as we start with an understanding of those evidentiary patterns and move to the explanations beneath them, Get to the logic, the false logic, the counter logic that is there, but then also share that and help point out where that is missing and why that doesn't match up. And I love this idea that was shared too. Much of this will be informational, but at its core, it'll also be inspirational. And you always have to hold to the idea that that inspiration is always possible, because you don't have to create anything within others. It's already there. And for them to be touched by that and to see that and to realize that is powerful. So it does in some ways start with you committing within your own heart and own mind to avoid these paradoxes, even in the small degrees. Oh, well, I would never be sexually involved before marriage. Yeah, but will you physically be counterfeit in a relationship? Will you push it to a line to say, well, that's the line that won't get me in trouble with my ecclesiastical leader, but anyway, that you start to physically disconnect and not have the symbols connected to the commitment, to the emotion. The same type of process and pattern occurs. As we share that, as we model that, and as we have opportunity to get into these deeper dialogues, we have great opportunity and great possibility to help others see that there can be new and different patterns, that there can be cultural trends that can restore the fragmented marriage and family culture that we have. Reconnect the sacred. Bring back the sexual meaning and power that is in chastity and purity, both before and after marriage. And at its core, reconnecting it to its foundations, as it's needed and desperately has to be, a child-centered relationship, institution, and part of our culture and part of our society. Thank you.
That? Where do you want some questions? Why don't we take just a couple minutes and invite our panel up again, make some questions, and then Jason has a couple things to say just to end. And so we only have just a few minutes, but we have a time for a couple if any of you would like to ask some questions.
So during the presentation, it sounds like a lot of these paradoxes, and you're using a lot of metaphors that are associated with things like testing a new car, or this satisfaction guaranteed sort of idea. It seems to be this idea of instant gratification, of how does it meet my needs? How do we, we have to test it, and if we don't like it, then we can return it. How do we kind of help combat that idea and help them see that marriage can't just be treated as another material gain or another accomplishment to have on a resume? How do we help them see that?
One of your starting points that's tied to that is our culture right now is deeply committed and messaging a finding ethic of marital success. And it might be because your generation is the first generation that gets to actually call dating an industry, right? And so this finding idea that relationships work, and it ties into the identified kind of soulmate ideas, that relationships will work when you get people that are meant to be together, right? At its core, that becomes the faultiness of that this is just about finding. And then you added to it, that healthy dose of individualism and, hey, isn't that great that it works for me? But even if someone's trying to be a bit more benevolent than that, the finding idea is still, success is going to be found. It also is what creates complete dating paralysis in many cases, because now that choice is so overwhelming. It's going to come down to one choice. I think what we have to try to help see, and it's a reality. It's not just a different paradigm. It's the fundamental reality of the design, as we've talked about, is that relationships are created and they're made. The process matters deeply in what occurs and what happens and how we form it, how we choose it, how we go about this entire process, which also, thankfully, for those of us inclined to a little bit of anxiety, is also a little bit more giving. There can be a few choices and decisions along the way that we'd say, oh, I'd like a do-over on that. Okay, make it differently now. Change it a bit. Little trial and error will be okay. But relationships evolve and grow. I wouldn't call him the world's best marriage expert, but this is where Mark Twain used to talk about the idea of true love. And he said that no one can really know what true love is until they've been married for a quarter century. And so a process there, and understanding that we create that and we grow that, will get us away, hopefully, from this kind of commodification process and idea that it's just simply found. Relationships are absolutely meant to be. They're meant to be what the two people mean them to be. And if you mean them and you move them in that direction, you can create whatever you desire it to be. Now, a big proponent of healthy, wise, smart dating and courtship, and I'm not saying just, grab anybody on the street, but the idea that after that wise process, we create and we form and we become is so very different than this idea that this is a relationship that is just simply found.
Thank you.
If I could just
Go ahead.
add one thing to that, which is I think that a big part of this, finding theory of I just have to find my soulmate. It's going to appear magically and everything's going to work without any effort. A big part of that is a view of marriage toward which our culture has moved over the past few generations, which is a kind of emotional satisfaction view of marriage, as opposed to a view of marriage which is really about commitment and choice. Obviously, commitment and choice made after having considered carefully whether this is the right person or not. But in an emotional satisfaction view, there's really not much that you can do. I mean, you have some ability to foster emotion and so on, but really emotion happens. And emotion varies depending on the season and whether it's sunny or whether it's cloudy or whether you had lunch or whether you have a headache or how much sleep you got last night. I mean, it depends on your stage of life. I mean, there are certain periods where you just have ups and downs, right? Emotion is something that you can't control. And so if relationship is fundamentally about emotion, then there's no way it can really be permanent, or maybe you could be really lucky and have pretty stable, decent emotional connection with somebody, forever with no deep sort of ditches or difficulties. But the reality is, for most of us, there are going to be ups and downs because that's just the nature of who we are as human beings with sort of fragile emotional conditions. But if you have a view of commitment, you can say, no, I understand and I've committed to building a life together and, God willing, a family together with this person, and I'm going to stick it out, which means a daily choice to do the kinds of things that will keep the relationship strong, that will build the healthy emotional connection, because obviously you can do things that'll predictably build that or predictably destroy it. And that choice model is one where, again, there are probably many, many people with whom one could have a successful marriage, and it's a matter of, finding the person with the right values and qualities and so on, but then choosing and committing and then making it work, as opposed to just sitting back as a spectator in your own life and say, well, I hope it works out.
Very briefly, I'd like to say something connected with that. I completely agree with Melissa. We can't directly control emotion. And that's very important because people think that promising to love each other in marriage vows means I promise to have a certain feeling forever, and you can't promise that. That's ridiculous. You can promise only a commitment of your will to the true good of the other person. There are indirect ways in which we can influence our emotions, though, and this is compatible with the fact that we can't directly. For instance, and this connects with Jason's point about the dating culture, it's not enough to just have a firm resolution. I'm just not going to have sex before marriage. you're going to find yourself experiencing very strong sexual emotions and desires if you put yourself in certain positions. So when you're dating, go to some public place, have a meal together instead of saying, well, we'll watch a video at his apartment at 11 p.m. in a dimly lighted room. You're guaranteeing practically that you're going to feel certain kinds of emotions that may overwhelm your resolution.
Let's take these two questions and go ahead.
I could ask questions all day, obviously, and maybe it's because the microphone is on my side and I don't have to walk all the way across like yesterday. But, okay, so what I'm seeing from the data that was presented yesterday, and from what you're saying in connection to it, that with marriage, it's not necessarily the age that makes the difference, but the education that one has about marriage and the union and about self. The other thing that I'm throwing in with this is you said, you contradicted yourself on an area where you said, we don't create in someone because it's already there. But then you also said, we create a marriage and we create a relationship. But in reality, it's already there within all of us to make it work. The only thing that we're all missing is education. And it doesn't necessarily mean BYU or any college. Any person can receive education. Is that really the core of what we're getting down to when it comes to our marriage and family and relationships? Is it's the education surrounding it?
Yeah, a couple of things. Education isn't the term I'd actually use, because to me maturation and education aren't the same thing. So I think education can be very helpful, but I don't think that's at its core. And I don't think it's a contradiction, because the idea of what is inside of us and our desires doesn't mean that it's between us. I've seen plenty of couples at the crossroads of what you choose to create between you is going to take this relationship this way or it's going to take it this way, right? And so there is still very much of what's in between. So it is there. It's there for us. The evolutionary psychologists would call it, we're pair bonding creatures. All of that is there. People resonate to what is in harmony with their nature, right? So these paradoxes are no different than someone trying to water their flowers with gasoline and saying, hey, that's just the way I do it. It's going to be fundamentally against that nature. So that is there, and I think people can feel it, can resonate it. I do think a couple still has to create that in a relationship. It's not just kind of a determined, we're automatically going to go this course or this course. There's a lot of choices and parts around that. So the maturation part, and part of it is education, part of it is around that, but to me there's also a deeper sense of, it's a conviction. And I definitely wouldn't tie it to being something that just simply is university education, or I think there's goat farmers in Tibet that have amazing marriages. And so there's a lot of this natural understanding and natural pattern that has come to be recognized and understood. With the age part, and I wasn't able to get into much of the data in detail, what we see is a pretty strong empirical pattern that teenage marriages have great risk. But by the time of the early 20s, the age benefit stops really increasing. And so this idea that the 18-year-old has a fundamentally different prospect than the 22-year-old bears out in the data. Going another 4 years from the 22-year-old to the 26-year-old, not so much. And from the 26-year-old to the 30-year-old, we might actually be starting to head in the other direction in some ways. And so age does start to become a minor factor once we get past kind of that threshold of old enough. And the factors that predict marital success, and the premarital prediction patterns now have formulas of up to 90% prediction, do get to these patterns of personal readiness and couple patterns that are predictive of that. And I do believe we need a better culture that helps young people understand and know what differences will make a difference, what things to pay attention to. Many of the dating lists, so to speak, that people are what they're looking for aren't really the things that will have the biggest kind of impact. And so, but I also see a lot of parents arbitrarily setting ages and saying, well, until you're graduated from school, or until you're 25 years old, or until you're 30 years old, right? Ultimately, a child will be much better served with to say, this is what a healthy relationship looks like, this is what a good foundation is, And if you have that and you have found that, whether you're 22, 25, 28, or 32, that's what you go with. And if you haven't found that, well, then don't get too concerned about age the other direction too and say, well, but I'm getting older. Well, that's okay. You still want that foundation, because now age isn't much of a predictor. Once you get past 20, 21, 22, you don't have much prediction, yet we make a very big deal about age to young people today, as if hitting age 25 in and of itself will make you ready. Yeah. You have just as much chance to be immature and have a poorly founded relationship.
I would suggest that maybe this is one way to think of it. We don't have the virtues already within us, but we have the potentiality to acquire the virtues with the help of discipline and with the help of grace within us. But they have to be acquired. There are a lot of ways of using the word maturity, but if maturity means acquiring the virtues, then yeah, it's what's critical is acquiring the virtues, not age per se. Although, of course, since it takes time to acquire the virtues, that's correlated with age.
Quarter century, right? That's what Mark Twain would say. No.
Last question. Go ahead.
So I've had some kind of negative experiences with like sex and modesty education within the church, and I'm wondering what you would say is a good way to teach kids not to have sex without making it this scary thing that they shouldn't be enthusiastic about.
First thing you do is you take marriage prep, okay? We spend a lot of time on that, because you're right. A lot of people are developing, young people, what could be called negative sexual conditioning. They've got this negative idea, this is bad, this is inappropriate, it's only been taught to them as this is something that can harm, this is something that can be, right? And so you're right, we get negative side effects of trying to encourage chastity or purity, but if it's done through the idea that this will be harmful, then it's very hard to have any sense of comfort around that. It's also a part, if I can wax for a minute here on this, it's part of my concern about some of the dialogue right now in conservative cultures around pornography, and we're raising the voice of warning of that, but it's often not being coupled with a strong and rich conversation about healthy sexuality. And so pornography is negative, right? So pornography is bad, pornography is sex, so sex is bad. Wow. Or the modesty parts too, right? We have these great lessons where at the core it's, we tell our young women that basically men are like wolves, you're like red meat, they want to eat you. And notice in all of that too, we never acknowledge female sexuality. So the message comes out as one that males have a pathological sexuality, women have no sexuality. But then we follow that up with marriage is great, go do that, right? And that doesn't fit too well either. So I'm a big proponent that we need to get a foundation in our lives, in our homes, in our religious communities, in the broader culture that is embedded in discussions of healthy sexuality and the meaning, the purpose, the beauty, the pleasure that can be a part of that in our lives. It is intended, divinely intended, to be the grand symbol of the marriage union. And it sets it apart from all other relationships. That's why we safeguard it so intensely before, or we should, and why we should be so faithful and so committed to it within, right? And so I think as we do that, it's very possible for us to hopefully within our own hearts and homes and communities, have a culture that recognizes and has the warning about these inappropriate, negative, counterfeit forms of sexual expression, but that's going to be best be done when people know and understand the true. Now, if a person finds themselves or a generation finds themselves saying, hey, this is pretty common, and my experience is it's pretty common, it actually becomes a call of this generation. To recognize that. And in some ways it may not be the best foundations, but something you seek after so intently can become so meaningful to you and say, you know what, I'm going to do that differently. So then when I'm the mother, when I'm the youth ministry leader, when I'm going to do that a little bit different, and I'm going to teach that differently because I recognize some of the negative side effects of this only being seen as something that can harm and damage, the fear approach to staying away from it.
Yeah, I would just add to that I was recently reading a beautiful article written by one of my colleagues at Catholic University, Father James Brent, about chastity, and he makes, I think, a fantastic analogy with the Olympic athlete, and says, when we see the Olympic athlete, going to the gold and, watching that person with, all of their sort of physical powers so well developed after so many years of hard training and discipline, we celebrate that as this incredible achievement, and all the years of training and all the discipline that went into that and all of the no's that had to go along with the discipline and the training. We valorize those because we see that they're aimed at this great and noble aim, right, of developing these potentialities that the person has in terms of athletic capacity and so on. And he presented chastity basically as something similar, that there's a beautiful sort of gold medal right there at the end of the race. It's developing, we have as humans these potentialities on the physical plane, athletic skills and so on that we can develop. But as sexual beings, well, there's a particular potentiality that we have there too, which is this capacity for marriage, right? For this beautiful, unique kind of relationship that takes a lot of work, not just when you're there, but it takes a lot of work prior to train the muscles, and the capacities, the dispositions, the character traits, the virtues that will enable you to have a successful marriage. So when you think about all these preparatory things in terms of the things you have to say no to, or the situations that you have to avoid and so on, or even, the kind of clothing that you wear so as not to provoke difficult situations, or not to provoke even in yourself a way of seeing yourself that is unhealthy, that all of that training is valuable and beautiful and positive, profoundly positive, because it's all about making yourself sort of fitted out for this great human good that then you can enjoy. And, if you're actually called to marriage, of course, we'll enjoy it in that form. But also, there's a good in being sort of fitted out for that, even if you're not called to be married per se, but you're called to live out your femininity or masculinity in other ways.
Well, let's thank the panel one more time.